Railroad engineers, have you ever come across anything creepy or weird on the tracks while driving your train? 1. I have 2 stories. I work in the electric traction department of Amtrak in the Northeast. One night, we had a report of wire theft in a remote location along the Harrisburg Run, and we were sent out to investigate. Typically, the work crews get there before the police, so we'll usually hang back a bit until the men with guns get there, just in case the perpetrator is still around. We showed up and saw some wire hanging and some guy lying on the ground. We assumed he had hit a live wire, got fried, and was now dead. We walked up and shouted to the guy, but we didn't get a response. After about 10 minutes, the police showed up and started taking pictures of the scene. One cop grabbed a stick and poked the dead guy a few times just to make sure. No movement. Definitely dead. The cop with the camera took a picture of the dead guy. When the flash went off, the dead guy jumped up, screamed the loudest scream I've ever heard, and took off running. The cop with the stick started chasing after him with the stick above his head, while his partner and our crew just stood there trying to figure out what the fuck had just happened. I was on a standby crew at night during a storm with 2 other guys. I was put on a piece of equipment called a cat car, while the other 2 guys decided to hang out in the truck. With the cat car running to keep it warm, I decided to lock up and take a nap. I locked both doors with padlocks on the inside, so there was no way anyone could get in without me letting them in. A few hours later, I woke up to some heavy wind and decided to check with the other guys to see if our supervisor had called with any trouble. When I got to the door, the lock was missing, but I couldn't open the door. Same with the other door. I called the other guys to come help, and when they got there, they asked how I managed to lock the cat car from the outside. If you're not quite following that, the padlocks that were originally on the inside, locking the only 2 doors into the equipment, were now on the outside. The 3 of us couldn't figure out what happened, but it creeped me the fuck out. 2. Conductor here? One time, in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, it was 10 degrees with a foot of snow on the ground, and my train went into emergency. I had to walk the length of the train to see what the problem was. The train was right in the middle of a very small town. As I was walking by one of the houses on the outskirts of this town, I saw a guy standing in the driveway about 50 feet from me, wearing a trench coat and a sock hat type thing. The first thing that struck me as odd was that it was way too cold to be wearing a trench coat. I shined my lantern on the guy, waved, and said, "Hi." Nothing. The guy didn't even move. I continued walking past him to the end of the train while looking back very often. I got to the end, turned around, and headed back. When I got back to the house where this guy was standing, he was still there, in the same place and the same position. I didn't even say anything this time. I just speed walked back to the head of the train. The next day, I was taking a train back home during the day. I paid special attention to this house as we went by it. There was nothing there. The drive wasn't shoveled. Nothing was there that could have been mistaken for a guy in a trench coat. I have since been by this house dozens of times, and I have never seen a car parked there, a light on, or anything at all. TLDR, saw a scary guy in a trench coat standing in the driveway of an abandoned house at 3 in the morning in the middle of winter. 3. U.S. freight conductor. Aside from the close calls with kids at 70 miles per hour and the animal strikes, I really only have one worthy story. However, my buddy has one that stuck with me and still haunts him. While following a train through a block, they came upon what looked like trash on the rail. It isn't uncommon for stuff to fall off the train or blow up against the rail, so we don't pay much attention to it. Except this pile of trash rolled over and looked at the oncoming train before they went over it. They were going slow enough that they got stopped with just a motor having gone by. The conductor went back, and it was a dude who had previously been run over by the preceding train. Turns out, this kid had been out for his 21st in a downtown area near the rail. He tried to drunkenly climb through the train when the train took off. He fell onto the rail and lost an arm above the elbow, one leg mid-thigh, and the other leg just below the knee. He was so hammered that he didn't go into shock and didn't realize he had been sliced up. This much pressure just seals the wounds, so he wasn't in too much danger of bleeding out. Having a pile of trash roll over and look at you with vacant human eyes right before you roll over it will mess with you. My story. I had just discovered The Walking Dead. I typically don't do scary stuff, but this was just below my threshold for watching. I binge-watched 2 seasons. Cue call to go get on an all-nighter, a dog of a train into the mountains west of Denver. At about 3 a.m., my train was stretched out along a steep hill through a couple of tunnels when it went into emergency. I replaced the knuckle but still needed to inspect my train to make sure it was all on the rail due to excessive hazmat. As I was walking back, I saw a game trail crossing the rail and noticed a large cat track. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. My mind started racing, but I had a job to do. I had been walking in deep snow until I got to the first tunnel, where I was back on ballast. I made it halfway through the tunnel when I thought I heard something kick ballast behind me. I turned off my silly little lantern, killed my headlamp, and pulled my knife, getting ready for the zombie onslaught. Then I heard it. A slow, rhythmic moaning coming from the end of the tunnel I was headed toward. I spent 5 minutes wondering if this was a horrible dream, if someone was fucking with me, or if I was crazy. I flipped my light back on, illuminating the pitch black. No zombies. Just the moaning. I eventually made it to the source of the noise. An elevated temp tanker had chosen this point in my life to vent. The rhythm came from the liquid sloshing back and forth. I finished what I needed to do, and we continued on our way. I still pass through that tunnel and chuckle about how close I was to getting all Mad Max on the world. 4. My grandfather was a signalman for the railroad before moving up the ladder. This was way back when they didn't have trucks to ride on the rails but had to use an open-air type vehicle. He would get calls in the middle of the night. He worked in Louisiana, Missouri, and Arkansas. There was a lot of the typical stuff: wild animals, people, most likely hunters, in the woods at night, etc. The 3 creepiest stories I've heard were these. The first was when he had to show up to a suicide. The man ran at the train with open arms. The engineer was understandably disturbed and ended up quitting. The second is a tunnel in my town called the Tunnel of Love, by locals. It's spray painted at the entrance. People would find animal limbs there, wild animals but also dogs and cats. They were probably just hit by the train, but the bodies would be absent. Once you got about a quarter of the way through, you could also hear what sounded like people singing in the distance and things banging on metal. He used to take my mom and her siblings in there on the open-air vehicle and stop in the middle. He'd tell them, "If you see or hear a train, press yourselves against the walls." Obviously, he knew the schedules and wouldn't put them in danger, but he had fun watching them squirm. The last wasn't something he saw, but something that happened on the day of his funeral. He died of a heart attack, but not immediately. He remained on life support for about a month. Regardless, it was sudden, and he was still working at the time. The day of his funeral, members of the railroad company followed behind the hearse in the railroad trucks. As they were going through town, all of the lights and crossings were going crazy. After the funeral, my mom approached some of his coworkers and asked which one of them had set that up, and all of them were just as baffled. No one had any idea what was going on. We like to think it was his way of saying goodbye to his coworkers and family. He had worked at the company his entire life, and my mom and I have both had experiences where he came to us in dreams that were very different from regular dreams. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was a big coincidence, but maybe not. He also saw the Gurdon light, which I think is actually swamp gas. 5. A large part of my family works for the railroad, and here is what I've heard. Not all creepy, but scary. My dad, who is a no-nonsense 6'6" man, came home one night after a derailment and was white as a sheet. He told my mom he met a man walking away from the derailment, which was in the middle of the woods. He didn't think it was too weird because some people check out wrecks and derailments. Anyway, my dad got to the derailment and said hey to my uncle. The cause of the derailment was a truck that had been hit and then pushed by the engine. Now, none of this was weird until my dad saw the man in the truck. It looked like a beat-up version of the man he had met on the way to the derailment. He got the man's driver's license when the sheriff's deputy showed up. The way my uncle put it was, "Your dad almost passed out and had to sit down." He didn't say why, because you don't do that around railroad men. My uncle was walking the rails, which you do to prevent derailments and such, and he had to pee, so he went into some woods. He said he walked up on what he was sure was some kind of animal sacrifice weird shit. He called the other workers to see it, and they were very creeped out. They just left and tried to make a joke of it. The number of drunk hobos and homeless people who pass out on the rails is oddly high. Also, a hobo was found dead in a hopper car, the kind that is open and typically holds grain. They figured that since it was summer, he wanted more air circulation and hopped into that one. Well, the car was filled, and no one really looked inside it. It wasn't figured out until the car was unloaded. 6. This happened on the L train in Chicago. I got on the Orange Line train heading north from Halstead. The train car was empty except for a passed-out hobo in the corner. At the next stop, this weird-looking old guy got on, locked eyes with me as soon as he entered, and despite having a completely empty car's worth of seats to choose from, sat down directly behind me. He never broke eye contact as he did, and he had some of the most sunken blue eyes I had ever seen. He rode behind me for a few stops while other people filed in and out. The whole time, I could feel him burning a hole in the back of my head. I got off at a transfer station, and I watched as the doors closed behind me. Creepy old guy was still sitting in his seat, still gazing into my eyes as the train pulled away. I ran through the station to my next train, and after riding it for several stops, I got out and looked around for my friend, who said she would meet me at the platform. As the people dissipated from the station and I looked for my friend, I realized the same guy from the train I had been on earlier, the same one that I saw pull away with him still on it, was at the end of the platform and still staring intensely at me. I froze, felt confusion slowly fade to horror, and booked it out of there. Told my friend, and she was like, okay. 7. I'm not an engineer, but when I was younger, I was allowed to ride in the cab of the locomotive at my local non-profit railroad. They just do train rides on Sundays. However, this was a special trip on a Saturday because the engines had just gotten new paint. Well, I was allowed to ride in the cab for the trip. Along the way, the engineer and I were making small talk, but then we noticed something weird on the tracks. We thought it was a stick or an animal. As we got closer, however, I noticed it was a man lying down and waving. I yelled to stop the train. We were only traveling about 25 miles per hour due to poor track conditions. We managed to stop short, about 10, maybe 15 feet from this guy. I stayed in the cab, and the engineer got out to see what this guy was up to. As it turned out, it was an old man in diabetic shock who had collapsed. He said that he normally walked the tracks on Saturdays because he knew the train normally ran on Sundays. Paramedics and police were there within 15 minutes. Luckily, the tracks were right behind a neighborhood. They loaded the man into the back of an ambulance and took him to the hospital. After being delayed about an hour, we started to head back. The weird thing, though, was that the engineer said he had no idea it was a man on the track. If I hadn't recognized him, he might have run the man over. Aside from that, the train never runs on Saturdays. Imagine if we had never come across this guy. How long would he have been lying there on the tracks? Or would the train have run him over the next day on Sunday? I guess it was some sort of fate, perhaps. 8. I was driving down a rural road in Wyoming, going from one drilling rig to another. This was in the Powder River Basin, so there's coal mining going on too, and many train tracks that carry all that coal away. So I'm driving a pickup with a guy named John. There's a truck pulling a lowboy ahead of us. He's got a tractor on the lowboy. We come to the train crossing, which is pretty rough. The lowboy starts to crawl over the tracks, then stops. He got hung up on the tracks. I stop for a minute and ask John, "Hey, should we stop and help?" John says, "Heck no, he did it to his own dumbass." So, he's the boss, and I keep going. We go down about a mile, and the road curves around, then starts heading back the way we had come. We were pretty close to the rig, but not so close that the rig noise could drown out the sound of a train whistle. I look back at the tracks, and that lowboy is still sitting right where we left him. Holy shit, John. There's a train coming, and that guy's still on the tracks. I stop the truck. Quick, drive up that hill so we can see better. He's the boss, so I go. As I am climbing the hill, unable to see anything, I hear a noise. Not sure if it's the rig or not, but something. We get over the hill and can't see. So we do our thing on the rig and start heading back. The train is stopped on the tracks. I stop the pickup and start walking to get around the train. I was so scared that there was going to be death and mayhem on the other side, but if there was, I figured we were the last people to see that guy alive, so we'd better go see. Got around the train, and it was all good. The train barely nicked the truck, knocking it askew, but the lowboy and tractor were sitting there just fine, and the driver was okay too. I often wonder, if we had stopped, would we have all been so engrossed in trying to get that lowboy off the tracks that we wouldn't have even noticed the train coming? I'll never know, but it was still a weird experience for me. 9. This is going to be one of those friend of a friend things and is only mildly interesting, but here goes. My father's friend was a train engineer for the NB Southern Railway, and being an industrial area, there are a lot of industrial sites serviced by rail. Most of them are owned by the conglomerate that also owns the railway itself, Irving. So he's bringing the train into the pulp and paper mill, and there's a spot where the tracks enter some kind of shed. It's not an open entryway. There are giant, heavy steel doors that need to be opened to allow the train to enter. Well, somehow, the tracks leading to this doorway had become soiled with some sort of grease or oil. So here's my dad's friend, driving the locomotive, putting on the brakes, and nothing happens because there is now lubricant between the rails and the wheels. The train just slides along like a well-oiled machine. He leaned out the side of the cab and very calmly told his brakeman, "You'd better jump off. We're going through those doors." The brakeman did hop off, and the locomotive did go right through the heavy steel doors, ripping them off the wall. It did something like 6 figures worth of damage to the building, I think. Whoever was responsible for greasing the rails probably caught some serious hell over that. 10. I was working at a BNSF railway in Stockton, California, maintaining the cranes that pull cars off the tracks when a freight engine rolled in with the front end a little caved in and covered in red. The entire front end was covered in what appeared to be red, bloody chunks, a paste left over from rolling through maybe a herd of cattle or a horde of zombies. I didn't know what to think. I felt my stomach churn, and my coworker turned green and heaved a bit. I asked the foreman what happened, and he told me some teenager had jumped out in front of it. Later, I grew a pair and walked up to it while these folks were cleaning it without any signs of being affected by the sight. Turns out, the train had hit a stalled fiberglass trailer filled with tomatoes that was headed to the Hunt's Cannery in Oakdale. TLDR, saw a train covered in red bits, was told it was a pop person, turns out it was tomatoes. 11. I worked in a rail yard. Not out on the rails themselves as an engineer or conductor, but we saw a few interesting things. My buddy saw what he thought was a black garbage bag lying inside the well of an intermodal car. We had to remove any debris, as the shipping containers wouldn't fit in properly. He reached in to grab it and quickly pulled it up, only to discover it was a dead vulture. Feathers fell off, and he dropped it and began screaming and running down the tracks. I was hysterical. I told him he still had to get it because it was on his side of the train. Best story, though, was working the overnight shift. A train came in and was parked. A few hours later, I saw a disheveled man walking around looking lost. I had heard stories that we occasionally still get hobos riding the rails, and this gentleman was my first. Official railroad policy is to call the cops and have them arrested for trespassing. But the unwritten rule was, if it appeared they were not trying to steal or vandalize anything, to just escort them off the property. I asked the guy if he was looking for the exit, and he said he was. I pointed it out to him, and he thanked me. He turned and said, "Hey man. Where the hell am I? I've been riding the rails all day, fell asleep. I had to get the hell out of Baltimore." I looked at him and said, "Baltimore?" He looked confused. Apparently, he got on the train at the rail yard across town, rode over to a classification yard, fell asleep, and woke up in our yard across town. 6 hours, and he had gone about 5 miles. He was pissed. I was trying not to laugh as he was muttering to himself out the gate. 12. Not an engineer, but I have a great engineer story. So back when I was 17, about 20 years ago, I decided I didn't want to go to school that day and convinced my friend, who was 16, to skip school and hitchhike to the next town over, 27 miles away. We got picked up after about an hour of trying to hitchhike by a fellow named Doozer, like Fraggle Rock, and he was a train engineer on his way to work. So we got in his truck, and my buddy had to have the guy's cooler on his lap while he was driving. While we were chatting with the guy, he was chewing on a cigar and told my buddy to crack open a beer for him and that we could help ourselves. So there we were, having our first ever beers with a train engineer on our first attempt at hitchhiking. After a few minutes, we started asking him all sorts of questions about how to hop on trains and what things we should know about, and he gave us all sorts of information, like where to hide, to watch out for the people around the train depots, always bring water, etc. Then he put his cigar out and lit up a joint. So there I was, drinking my first beer, smoking my first joint, hitchhiking for the first time with a train engineer named Doozer. Overall, besides the 40-ish mile walk home, it was one of the happiest days of my teenage years. 13. My dad worked for BNSF for 43 years before he retired 4 years ago. He was a yardmaster, but still saw some pretty strange stuff. 2 stories immediately jumped to mind. A young couple in the 70s were making out on the platform before an Amtrak train was taking off. The girl was supposed to be inside, but she kept making out with her boyfriend all the way up to and past the last calls before departure. The train was leaving the station when she realized she wasn't on board. For some reason, she decided to jump onto one of the ladders and just hold on. This was a train leaving Blaine, Washington, and heading to Seattle, so it would be a good chunk of time before it stopped. My dad happened to be out inspecting something totally unrelated and was the only railroad employee to see this happen. He had to rush back to the station in order to radio the conductor and stop the train. People drove out to where the train stopped, and the girl was alive, but in such a state of shock. Her hands were so tightly wrapped around the ladder that she could not let go. I don't remember how long it took them to get her to physically let go, but it wasn't easy. Another time, he was doing an inspection in Sandpoint, ID, shortly after I was born, so the early 80s. He came across a family living in a train car. Of course, the policy is to not allow this sort of thing. He was supposed to call the cops and have them arrested for trespassing, squatting, etc. Instead, he told them that he wasn't going to do anything, but if someone else caught them, they'd probably be removed pretty aggressively. Ooh, and one more story I just thought of. When working in Blaine, he would be the last point of contact for trains entering from or coming from Canada. He was supposed to inspect all the proper forms for customs and such, also back in the 70s, which is strange since a non-government employee was doing this. He found one car that didn't have everything properly filled out, so he had to deny entry. Turns out, the CEO of the company that had that freight was a personal friend of the CEO of Burlington Northern, so he actually got a personalized letter from the CEO of Burlington Northern informing him that he had made a grave mistake and that any similar action delaying transport for his friend would result in the loss of my dad's job. Dad probably could have been praised as a whistleblower, but it was a drastically different time. During this time, the railroad would also change the currency in which he was paid depending on which had lower value, the loonie or the US dollar. 14. I have 2 stories from third parties. I worked as a cook for a retired railroad engineer as my first high school job. In his old age, he built a barbecue restaurant in front of his house in this little country valley near Warner, Oklahoma. He said that the worst thing that ever happened to him was hitting a car that was crossing the tracks without looking both ways first. In the old days, there weren't crossbars at every location, especially in rural areas. He couldn't see the mother driving, but her child was standing in the passenger seat, staring into his eyes all the way up to the point that he smashed right into her. Both died. He still had nightmares about it. He's been gone for about 10 years now. Hopefully, he's resting in peace. The other time, a few of my friends had crossed some tracks to get from one strip mall to another in Muskogee, Oklahoma. On their way back, they were just hanging out in this train underpass, talking, when a train went by with its brakes screeching. About 30 minutes later, the railroad police, yes, this is a real thing, yelled at them from the bridge over a loudspeaker to present themselves. They were all arrested, booked into the city jail, and released with misdemeanor fines of $850. Apparently, you can't be on railroad property unless it's a legal crossing, and the train was forced to stop even though they weren't anywhere near it. My friend told me the engineer was there to personally scold him for forcing the train to stop. 15. Not an engineer, but as a substance abuse counselor, I had a caseload of engineers and conductors who were sent to 90-day rehab. Most of these guys belonged to the union and were mandated to dry out after failing a random piss test. About 90% of the men I worked with had developed very serious addiction issues over the years due to the loneliness and solitude of the schedule, which pretty much sets them apart from family for days at a time. An engineer or conductor would typically receive notification on the same day and be out for 3 or more days. One day conducting or engineering a 100-plus boxcar train, 1, 2, or 3 nights in a motel, then one day conducting or engineering another 100-plus boxcar train back to the original station. In addition to the solitude and lonesomeness, these guys had yet another basic similarity in the horrific fact that each person had their own terrifying memory of killing someone by hitting them in various ways with the train they were conducting or engineering. Session after session, case after case, these men would disclose to me that they couldn't escape the memory of the first time someone stalled out on the train tracks and wouldn't get out of their car, or were walking on the tracks, or got drunk and passed out on the tracks, or jumped off a bridge into the train's engine, or tried to beat the train but came up short and got hit, or were walking on tracks opposite a train and not realizing another train was coming up from behind. And they had to drink or use dope to escape. The primary issue each man had was that the train was just unable to stop fast enough. It was definitely an eye-opening experience. I never knew that side of the railroad. 16. I'm not that kind of railroad engineer, but as the technical engineer type, I've taken many rides in the operating cab of test trains or on work trains for passenger transit in major U.S. cities. I have a story from each, and they are polar opposites. When I was maybe a year and a half into my first job, I was on a test train, and we were in normal operation, headed toward the designated test site. All of a sudden, I saw movement from the catwalk in a subway tunnel. The train operator gasped and slammed into the emergency brake, and the figure disappeared as we passed the area where we saw it. After calling into control, the operator was already a mess, assuming he had hit a person. He started by cursing up a storm, threw something nearby, then put his head in his hands. Control requested the exact stationing where we were and asked us to confirm what we hit. So, terrified, I opened the door and peered down at the tracks. I saw some blue jeans lying on the ground and remember stupidly thinking at first, wow, this guy was hit so hard that his pants came off? And, why is that blood so bright red? It looks fake. I just reported that I could only see pants and blood. We waited for the police to get there, and then my supervisor radioed the engineering team to leave the train from the back end, walk down the tunnel, and exit at the nearest station. Later on, I found out that the man had committed suicide, according to the note found in those jeans, and was found in 2 pieces. I assume he was probably somehow pinned between the catwalk edge, then twisted and torn as the train passed by. It's a horrible experience that makes me feel unsettled whenever I think back to it. The worst part is that I found most railroad workers have at least one such personal experience with a severely injured or killed coworker, passenger, or trespasser. The other story is much lighter. About 10 years ago, I was on a work train at around 3 a.m. on a Friday night, heading out to inspect new communication cable installations along the subway tunnels. These trains pass through stations, and move in general, very slowly. While passing a particularly busy station adjacent to a college campus, our crew was mock catcalled and even flashed by some of a group of about 10 female students. One yelled out to a younger coworker, since the platforms where some of us were standing were completely open, and blurted out her number, saying she expected a call when he was done working. He wrote it down, went ahead and called her at 4:30 a.m., when we were done, left a message, then met her the next night for drinks. They are now married. 17. I work as a backup janitor when the normal one isn't available. I've seen some very weird things at the places I've cleaned. There are the usual needles and beer cans, not that shocking after a while, but the weirdest thing I have ever seen was when I was called out to a train yard to clean out some disused engines. These things hadn't been used since the mid-90s and were going to be sold for scrap because they were too battered to be refurbished. I was warned beforehand that there might be a bum in one of them, but I brushed it off since I had seen many bums at the various places I cleaned. They usually just ran off when they saw me coming. So I picked up my bucket and got in the company truck to go out to the disused part of the yard where the trains were. Routine janitorial duties. As I was driving out there, I noticed that I had left the keys to the trains back at the office. Oh well, I figured. These things were so old that the door might not even be there anymore. So I drove out to the engines, parked my truck, and got out. Nothing was creepy at this point. Just some rotting diesel engines. I had seen much creepier things before. I walked up the railing and kicked in the door with little force. It didn't even have a lock anymore. I walked in, and I immediately noticed something very odd. It was in near mint condition. Great, I thought. One less room to clean. But then I noticed something very, very disturbing. A skeleton perched against a wall. Then I noticed that it was wearing a leather jacket and clutching a pill bottle in its bony hands. It was a suicide. I walked a bit closer and grabbed the pill bottle from its hand. The prescription date was October 9, 1996, over 10 years ago. This guy had been rotting in a train for 10 years, and nobody had noticed his absence. I pressed the button on my radio and told the guard to call the cops. There's a dead guy in here, and he's been here for a decade. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulled up, and an off-duty cop stepped out and walked up to the train. Turns out, this man had been missing since 1997, and nobody cared enough to look for him. He was an elderly man who had lost his wife and offed himself in a train. He laid there for 11 years and was never disturbed. When they buried him a few days later, I was the only one who came. All of his family was dead or didn't care enough to come. Sad and creepy. 18. A friend of the family is a now retired railroad man. He was in a caboose during World War II on an ammunition train when it exploded, and he somehow got out alive. Another time, very close to the same place as the explosion, they had to stop the train one night. The engineer called back, saying they were going to be there a while, so he could get off and stretch his legs. He did just that and stepped off a bridge, fell about 20 feet and broke a leg. I was a volunteer fireman. One day, when it was 10 below zero, we were called to a body on the tracks. I expected a body in 5 or more pieces. He was rolled up in a ball instead. He had been there all night. I wonder how long it took to thaw him out. Second body on the tracks, he was in at least 5 pieces. We thought it was an accident, but a letter was found in his home saying he was going to kill himself. 19. Former Gandhi dancer, or track repairman, for the CN here. There is some pretty weird shit out there, depending on what cities you run through. Mostly bodies, human or animal. One derailment I was called to was because someone had lit about 100 feet of track on fire and damaged the ties. When the train passed over it, it pulled the spikes right out, and the rails flopped over. Also, I was on site when a washout happened. We were there because the ballast was old and not draining correctly, and as I drove the truck over a section, I looked out to see the whole embankment just slide out from under the track. Nature is a scary bitch. Also, I've become really good at telling what animal a rib cage belongs to. Now I have a desk job. Sometimes I miss the field. 20. I work for a UK rail company and have patrolled the tracks a fair few times during my working life. This one time, we came across half a cat. It was strange because it looked like a perfect slice of the back end of a cat, with almost no blood pooled around it, and the other half was nowhere to be seen. Very odd. Another time, we came across a perfectly preserved rabbit's face in a cable route. Just its face, nothing else. I figure it was eaten by rats or something. The third story was when we found the head of a sex doll on the tracks, which from a distance looked very much like the head of a real person. I wasn't bothered by that thought. It happens enough, but the contractor obviously hadn't had many dealings with corpses or related body parts, so he was looking pretty worried as we approached. He was pretty relieved to see it wasn't a person. 21. Not an engineer, but I do operate a high-rail truck with train wheels on it that zips down the railroad tracks. I was working in the port of Metro Vancouver and had to measure out 2,500 feet from where we were working to do a certain regulatory test, so I jumped in my truck, reset my counter, and went on my way. I arrived at my 2,500-foot stop and jumped out to spray paint the railroad tie to mark that spot for the rest of the crew. I then realized I had no spray paint, nothing in the whole truck. I searched for a little flag I could put up, but I had none of those either. I ended up searching the ground for something like a stick or garbage that I could leave there in the middle of the tracks for the time being. Now, down in that part of Vancouver, the tracks basically run parallel to Hastings Street, and for those of you who have never heard of it, it's basically the world's biggest confined heroin problem. Drugs Inc. actually did their heroin episode down there. Anyway, you always find crazy shit along the tracks there. If it's not a body, it's 500 hypodermic needles. So in this giant pile of garbage, I found an old barbecue, complete with a set of barbecue tools like tongs and a brush, etc. I thought it would be pretty funny if I just set up a barbecue in the middle of the tracks. We were working there, so there was no chance of a train hitting it. So I went to move the barbecue and found, no joke, the biggest, longest, girthiest dildo I have ever seen in my life, even to this day. It was at least 3 feet long and had to have been almost a foot in circumference. Who is buying this type of thing? I decided this would be the best thing to mark the location with. I ended up finding a couple of old random shoes in that pile and, armed with the tongs I found earlier and a pair of gloves, I managed to jam the dildo, balls first obviously, into one of the shoes and got it to stand upright all by itself. I really wish I had been able to have my phone at work. I would have had a good picture for you guys. Anyway, with that spot marked for the next guy, I put my truck into reverse and headed back to the crossing we were working at. I arrived, and the foreman at the time asked how I marked the footage without taking the paint. I told him that he would eventually find out when we got there. We packed everything up and were waiting for a train on the opposite track to go by us when the train's brakes hammered on and started screeching. Scared the shit out of all of us. Now, when a train goes into emergency, everything stops, and the traffic controller is on the radio immediately. We were all told to stay where we were, as there had been a person struck by a train just half a mile from our job site. We took our truck off the tracks and headed down the parallel road to see what had happened. When we arrived, we found a CP police officer and 3 Port Authority vehicles there, all parked right beside where I had left my, marker. With the way it looked, how thick it was, and the fact that the top of it was red, I guess one of the Port Authority officers thought it was a severed leg and called it in to stop all trains in the area and call the police force as well. The look on my foreman's face was priceless when he looked back at me after looking at the 4 grown men standing around a 3-foot-high dildo stuffed into a dirty Reebok. We didn't say a word to anybody about it, as I'm sure we would all have been in shit. I hauled half a dead bear off the tracks on my second day working for this company. I've also seen a few dead bodies of people committing suicide by train, but they're just lying in the ditch. They didn't ever end up exploding like I thought they would. 22. Probably the strangest and most messed up thing would be the time we hit a flock of sheep at line speed, 110 kilometers per hour, or about 70 miles per hour. No idea how they got there. I guess the fence fell over, or the gate was left open, but the first I saw of them was what appeared to be long grass covering the tracks ahead. A second later, we realized they were sheep, so we started leaning on the whistle. A matter of seconds after that, we were on top of them. I can't forget the awful, continuous noise it made, nor can I unsee the bits of wool and guts flicking up onto the windscreen. The smell itself was horrendous, especially once the heat of dead sheep started cooking itself on the hot traction motors underneath. We pulled up at the next crossing loop to cross another train, so we got out and viewed the damage. I used to have photos, but that phone has since died. 23. I'm a railway engineer in the UK. This time of year is the worst for suicides, with 2 in the last 2 days on the route I work on. I've been track inspecting before after the cleanup of a suicide the night before, and they've missed a few bits, so what appears to be a bit of skull or kneecap can be seen. The worst bit is the smell. You become aware of the drug spots across the route too, with the number of needles under bridges. I've seen bongs made out of all sorts, blow-up dolls, vibrators, and worse to this day, half a used fleshlight. My gut wrenches the most when I see pets. Cats and dogs are frequently found. Some arseholes in certain spots are taping or gluing used needles to our access gates too. Total sickos. 24. When I was about 14, my family and I took a train trip down to Florida. From Philadelphia until the middle of North Carolina, it went smoothly. Then we had to suddenly stop. No train personnel would give any answers as to why. We waited for about 2 hours until we started moving again. I happened to look out the window on the left side and saw what looked like a slaughterhouse of animal meat. To this day, I have no idea what we hit or how many. About 6 years ago, 2 teenage girls decided to commit suicide via bullet train around where I grew up. My friend's father is a local firefighter and told us briefly about that day and what he saw. He had to walk about a mile or 2 up and down the track just to look for evidence of the 2 girls. He didn't get into great detail, but he did say that even though he had seen some shit in his 15 years on the job, the horrific scene mixed with their age messed him up mentally for a bit. 25. A friend of mine was a conductor at the time with the CPR, and they were going about 50 miles per hour at night, him and the hoghead half asleep on a long trip up in Alberta. All of a sudden, out of the dark, a woman walked right in front of the train. My buddy said it happened so fast, but he saw her body fly off to the side. The hoghead plugged the train, and it took over a mile to stop. My buddy reported it as they were slowing down. He jumped off the train after it stopped and started running back with his lantern. He said he never really thought it through, but perhaps she wasn't dead yet, and he should at least check it out. He said it felt like he ran forever, and then out of the darkness again, with his shitty little railway-provided lantern, there she lay. An arm twisted backward over her head and a leg obviously separated at the hip. He got closer and rolled her over, and at that very moment, hurled the contents of his stomach. He told me it wasn't so much that her mangled body grossed him out, but the fact that she died so suddenly and so violently. The investigation took several weeks, but the CPR police determined she had been drinking heavily that day. She was a 19-year-old native woman who had an argument with her boyfriend and made several errors in judgment that particular day. My friend will never be the same. Something this personal is not easy to forget. I give my friend big kudos for thinking and trying to save someone who had no chance of being saved. 26. I worked as a general laborer at the port over the summer, helping move rail cars filled with grain. The cars in the port move pretty slowly compared to when they're out traveling the countryside, but that makes incidents that do happen all the more terrifying. The only incident I saw with my own eyes was a rat get pinched under a wheel and have its left side burst open, with its entire insides popping out and landing next to the track, still in rat form. Other incidents at the port that I've been told by the regulars who have worked there for 50 years. A worker was walking to work one day, early morning shift, so it was still dark out, and tripped over something. He looked down and saw a severed human head just staring blankly up at him. Turns out some guy had committed suicide by jumping off the overpass into an oncoming train, and parts of his body went everywhere. Another guy committed suicide by laying a small red towel down over one of the rails and lying on his back, face up, with his neck over the track and his arms crossed across his chest. Then he just waited for a train to come. They found him in the morning, and he hadn't moved an inch. This was part of the track where the trains go pretty slowly. He definitely would have felt it for a split second, at least. On a lighter note, there was apparently an infamous train tagger who would graffiti trains with comic strips so that you could watch the trains go by and read the comics. 27. It's not my story, but my granddad worked his way up from station cleaner to signal operator. At one stage in his career, he was responsible for cleaning up after suicides. Now, if somebody jumps in front of a train moving at speed, two things can happen. You can fall in front of the train and get crushed by its wheels. This is nice and clean because the heat of the wheels, caused by friction against the tracks, cauterizes the wound, and all the cleanup crew needs to do is scrape you off. Lovely jubbly. This story concerns a fellow who hit the train at height and was splattered across the windscreen. Granddad and his boys were sent to find all the bits and put them in a bag. They looked all day and couldn't find the head. Eventually, it grew dark, and they postponed the search. The next morning, they didn't have to look long. The crows had done the job for them. This guy's head had been launched 2 stories up onto an old water tower, where it had somehow come to rest. Now, my granddad may have been bullshitting, but what creeped me out the most about his story was how much it amused him. 28. A few answers to this. Warning, detail and gore get worse as this goes. First, some background. During the 80s, I worked as an engineer, conductor, track maintenance worker, and derailment wreck master for a small railroad services company. We worked freight only, but I had friends, and I took many rides on some of the fast-moving passenger trains on the U.S. Northeast Corridor. My own fond memory was the 2 halves of the same turtle, one on each side of the track. Shell and bones mostly, likely placed there intentionally by someone before me. I just could not bring myself to disturb it, and eventually, it became a memorable visual marker along the tracks for me. Freight tracks are often out in the middle of nothing and nowhere, just trees and weeds, so a friendly, albeit long-dead familiar face was welcome. There is a lot of boring time out on the railroad. Now, onto the gory bit some are asking about. I've been in the cab of a passenger train engine hauling fast, up around 150 miles per hour. During daylight, visibility is usually decent if the weather isn't too bad. Point is, during the day, you can at least see what you are about to hit and can phone in an adequate report of, I just hit what seemed to be a washing machine that is now about 1/8 of a mile east of the tracks, or that sort of thing. At night though, yuck. The locomotive has one really big headlamp that lights up probably more than a quarter mile in front of you. Above 100 miles per hour, that's an entire fraction of a second to glimpse the dark figure your train is going to hit. The bugs dying on the windshield are constant at night. Basically, every square inch of windshield is taking a bug hit about once a minute. Lots of wiper fluid, which zips up and off the windshield real quick at those speeds, lots of windshield wiper use, and lots of streaky, squished bug bits getting blown up and toward the edge of the windshield. Real glamorous stuff. Impacting machinery is a bit unnerving because you worry about the metal bits getting in your wheel sets or communications gear. Mostly, though, you hear a dull thump, and some really dented metal box flies away from you. Why morons find entertainment in putting appliances on rail used by fast trains is beyond me. But hitting vertebrates, yeah, those are always a mess. The little birds make red circles on the windshield, and the red circle just expands and gets blown toward the edges of the windshield. Sometimes you see red streaking on your side door window and you just know your outside door handle has some on it. Larger birds make a decent thunk, and you can unfortunately see enough of the bits to tell that you just splattered a swan, goose, or something similar. Deer are uneventful hits, low enough that it's mostly in the wheels, below the sight of the passengers on the elevated platform you will next pull in and stop at. The cows are pretty nasty. They have enough mass that there is a decent sound on impact, a bit of a hollow, wet thwunk, and they leave a pretty bad mess on the front of the engine. Not my personal experience, but I've been told by other engineers about times they've rolled through herds of cows or sheep, just thwunk, thump, thud, bump, flump, and an engine that looks like the rolling slaughterhouse it just became. But the human suicides, those haunt you. For some reason, the women often choose a white dress, just stand there as the racing train comes at them, usually holding their arms outstretched to the side, usually looking up. You see the impact coming. You emergency brake all you can. On an 8+ car train over 100 miles per hour, with a quarter second's notice, you can take maybe 1, maybe 3 miles per hour off the speed of impact. You leave the brakes on full, stopping a couple of miles later. You radio in the suicide. The railroad and local police come to both your engine and back at the impact site, and usually have to walk the couple of miles in between, picking up bits. The worst is when identifiable remains are on your engine. Grim stuff. Sorry for the messes described. Other finds along the tracks have been human bodies. You see a limb partially sticking out of a bush or grass. Local animals tend to move dead things around a bit. Some coworker mechanic types have been known to use and leave biological lubricant on some hinge and handle areas. Gloves are pretty mandatory for rail workers. I witnessed another train, about half a mile from me, hit one of those porta-potty service trucks, basically a small tanker truck full of literal crap. Quite the sight, and then I hauled away from there as fast as I could, just praying to outrun the smell. Basically, rail work in the 80s was a bit like image searching the web for nasty sites, but in real life, for a paycheck, and most of the nasty sites you did not want to see. 29. Class 1 freight conductor, a few things. 16-year-old with his head and shoulders 50 feet up the track, with his body laying beside the track next to us. Friday night yard job, we saw 2 males having sex in the middle of a tunnel, just shit-faced, trying to wave us by like we were not a train on tracks. Just laid on the whistle until they left. I remember recruiting a train that had killed someone, and spending an hour looking in the bush for their hand. I didn't find it, then stepping in something that was red with hair. Going north, we hit a moose, not too far from the bunkhouse, called up on the radio, someone came down and grabbed it, cleaned it up, and we all ate it that night. I'm sure there is more, but it all blends in after a while, takes a lot to stand out. 30. I've been a conductor for about 8 years now. The main thing I have noticed about human behavior since I started working for the railroad is that people seem to view a train as a machine instead of a vehicle being driven by people. Because of this, they are willing to do horrible, ridiculous, and dangerous things that they probably wouldn't do if they thought another human being was going to be involved. Here's my list of shit my coworkers and I have seen. More teenagers and gay dudes fucking than you can shake a railroad lantern at. Drunks and druggies lost in the middle of nowhere, like miles from anywhere. A coworker came across a train hopper who had his legs sheared off when he tried to jump into an intermodal car without a bottom. The guy lived too. Another coworker found a teenage murder victim whose pimp tried to cover up her murder by dumping her body on a remote-controlled locomotive track. My uncle was a conductor on a train that hit a woman committing suicide who decided to take her dog with her. She lived. The dog didn't. I hit a man committing suicide. I was oblivious to what was going on until my engineer said, "I think that guy is going to jump in front of us." I could see the guy trying to time his jump. It was pretty disturbing because there was nothing you could do. A coworker came across $250,000 in counterfeit money in a gym bag. My uncle hit a cow once and managed to knock its asshole out. Some guys laid a bunch of landscaping stones and tie plates on top of the tracks for about 100 yards in front of their trailer park. We could see them all standing back from the tracks, drinking beers and waiting. It was all fun and games until our 12,000-ton train started crushing all the stones and sending shrapnel everywhere. A train one of my coworkers was on snagged a chain link fence that was being installed and rolled up the guys installing it inside the fencing. They don't think anyone got hurt. It was a pretty rough area, though, so they didn't stop to find out. Railroad workers deal with things most people never even think about. Which story stuck with you the most?